Brophy on this. Good evening, welcome. Please take a seat. You're all intimidating standing there. Make yourself extremely nervous. My name is James Hewison. I'm one of the collaborators of this show. So I'm really delighted to welcome you all this evening for this discussion, which is essentially largely based around the launch of Synths, Sax Situationists, which I'm delighted to say we have the author and in fact one of the collaborators, the owner, the curator of these posters, these remarkable posters from 1968. This is Thompson. Ian is also, I should add, not only the author of the book, Synths, Sax Situationists, which is to say the French music underground.
My wife has a list. Oh, sorry.
I'm here.
So I chose a really bad time.
You did. What a provocation. So accompanying the book will be the release of a double vinyl.
No, just
single.
there'll be two. Let's start this up.
One and then the other. Ian will talk about that in detail. Which covers a lot of the musicians and essentially the scene, as it were, or the scenes during that decade, subsequent to May 1968. I missed one. I think one I missed Ben about you. Well, he's a musician, I should add, and so he's going to talk. We are going to talk more generally about the posters, but also very much about the music. And to Ian's right is Phillip Brophy. I've been struggling to go, how can I multi-hyphenate?
Yeah, whatever.
Already met with the customary indifference of Phillip Brophy. So please welcome Phillip Brophy. We'll discover who and what he is as the discussion progresses. Let's begin with the most obvious point of reference being obviously the book at the end. So probably we'll begin by telling us how you became aware of this musical underground, what it was, and maybe provide a little bit of context politically at the events of May 68.
Yep. Okay, thanks a lot. Try and be brief. Basically, I didn't know any of this music. I knew some of these bands existed. There's a band Gong, who some people here will know, and their singer David Allen's from Melbourne. But it's interesting, they are a French band. Everyone I interviewed in France, Gong is French, right? So I knew of them. I heard Magma, who were another one of the bigger bands, and didn't like them. So I learned to love them. And I heard a band called Helden, which is an electronic band, but I didn't know any of the other music. And I knew Gong really well. I knew I didn't like Magma, but I knew Helden existed. And I went to France in 2017, was the last time I was there, and I was looking for Pink Floyd, the single of Arnold Layne. No, Single Plies. Came out in a picture sleeve in France. Didn't come out in a picture sleeve anywhere else. So I was looking for a copy of that. Went into record stores. And the first one I went into was Crocodisc near the Sorbonne. And they had the section of record. They didn't have that, but there's a section of Prog Francais records. And I went through and thought, what is this? And I came away with the Moving Gelatin Plants record. Was the one that I sort of thought, okay, I can sort of get with. The guy in the shop told me they like Soft Machine. I thought, yeah, I can get that. And that night I just went through the internet, looked for information, and found out about it, and then basically became obsessed. So politically, these bands came around about 1970, and I was sort of told, it's interesting, the legend behind all of this stuff is that, it's not related to May 68. So I spoke to them, and this is very related to May 68. Most of these guys were on the barricades. 3 of these guys were in the print shop.
By the way, May 68, can you just give a very brief sense of what it represented, or what it was, I should say, and maybe we can talk a little bit later about what it now represents.
Yeah. So, I mean, very briefly, May 68 started as a student movement. Actually started in Nanterre, which is there's one poster over there that mentions Nanterre. It's a university on the outskirts of Paris. Don't worry, I'm not going to get terribly detailed. But the rector shut down the entire campus. The people who were protesting, and a lot of it was about, as Chris pointed out to me, about sex. So it was about the fact that there was a brand new university, but they had exactly the same rules as the other universities. Males couldn't go to female dormitories, females couldn't go to male dormitories. That was one of the demands. And that's sort of what I say in the book because I thought it might get attention. It wasn't the entire thing, obviously. They got shut down. They went to the Sorbonne. They got shut down. The Sorbonne got shut. The police got called in. And the thing that really kicked things off was Sorbonne was right in the middle of the Latin Quarter. It's in a residential district. The people started seeing the baton charges and the fact that people, the police were indiscriminately hitting people. When the locals went down to help them, they got baton as well. And it just grew from there until it became a general strike. The whole country came to a standstill. So it went from being a university protest to being, I don't know how many million, I think it was at least 10 million on strike. So, is that?
Essentially, the protests were about General de Gaulle, who was formerly General de Gaulle, who essentially headed up the Free French forces in exile in England during the Second World War. He returned triumphant to Paris once France was liberated, and as it happens, amongst the things that he declared was that France will be rebuilt through culture, and actually most particularly he emphasised the cinema. As it happens, he also became increasingly authoritarian when he was elected president, and so the discontent was very much about this increasingly authoritarian president who made a lot of decisions in isolation, amongst a myriad of other issues, one of which being about sex.
Yeah, well, very vaguely. And I guess being from Brisbane, what was really interesting in talking to these musicians, it sounded exactly like Brisbane under Jovial Hewison, because we had a really, really vibrant music scene in Brisbane because it was so repressed out there, and people were ignoring the music, which was happening in France with anything that wasn't yaya or chanson. So people just didn't care and just made the music they wanted. So I suppose that's part of the spirit of 68. That sort of gave people the permission to do what they wanted to do. So they went on and they made music that they knew wouldn't sell. Some record labels tried to sell it and they failed badly, or they actually, there's a band called Majoun, which actually is a type of marijuana, who released a record on Vogue, and Vogue killed it. Vogue printed 200.
Wow.
Yeah, and didn't publicise it. So there's a lot of that. Comintern was another one of the political bands. Comintern, Communist International. And a lot of them were there. There was a band called Barricade. So there's a lot of political bands. But Comintern were on Path Marconi, which is EMI. Same deal. I think they pressed 500. And once they read the lyrics, they were softened away. So I've lost myself now, so that's back to Jane.
Thank you. And Phillip, your interest in the music of France from that particular epoch, does it stand aside, or is it
I guess, James, I haven't read the book because Ian's just read it to me, so I read a couple of those excerpts that Ian sent online. So I'm very much dying to read this because I think it's very important for any sense of cultural history from any place that there are these kind of let's call it kind of like a nerdy research approach to really doing a deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Going deeply into something and, using that energy to make contact with all the original surviving people before they all died. So there's a bit of an oral history component of it, which is very important for any of these ideas that are seeking to clarify what was happening in a cultural instance, socio-politically, culturally, that might enforce the mythology about it, it might kind of break the mythology, whatever, but it sets things up for then wider ongoing kind of discussions about it. And so I'm always reading any book that's kind of, doing something like that, and in the case of cinema, for example, we're currently going through just an unbelievable kind of, I wouldn't call it renaissance, but there are organisations like the AGFA, which for a while I thought was somehow connected with AGFA Film, but it's the American Genre Film Association, and they're involved with a number of, they're heavily involved with vinegar syndrome and things like that, and these are companies that are going to find the worst movies ever made in America by weird individual, Miami hardware store owners who then wanted to make a sex action movie in Florida, right? And yet they make one movie, right? And then when you see these movies, they're just like nothing on earth, right? They just kind of, because they're, in some senses they're kind of pretty bad, but in another sense, just viewed now from that historical distance, right? It's like that thing of having the original artifact brought back into our present so we can kind of see it, and so the myth about it fades away, and you can more directly have contact with it, right? In the case of prog rock, that's a particularly important thing, I think, that you've touched on, Ian, because prog is the last admitted genre of music. Probably in the future it will be high energy music. There's going to be some gallery somewhere, and there's going to be someone doing a presentation of high energy disco music from Europe, particularly summer hits, from like 1989 to
It's good grief.
I know, but that's the whole thing. When something's kind of forgotten or dismissed, and in the case of, as you mentioned, those labels, they didn't even want to release this stuff, right? Well, prog music has gone through a number of cycles, and bizarrely, one of the first true rediscoveries and reappraisals of prog music, which is short for progressive music. So this is like bands like Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Genesis, all these big kind of bands and whatnot, that punk completely kind of, that was in their target more than anything prog rock. But the first similar thing what you're doing in a reappraisal of prog rock was the Japanese appreciation of Australian prog rock. It's like the Japanese record store collectors and whatnot, which are the most famous in the world. They kind of sat down and thought, what is the most obscure kind of music that no one knows anything about and no one wants to know anything about? Australian prog rock. And so this was probably in about 1992, 93, huge explosion, right? And even the Australian historians is I've never heard of these bands before, because Glen A. Baker certainly wasn't fucking talking about them. And they were all independent productions, they were just kind of obscure things, and some of them aren't kind of that great, but the Japanese brought that research energy to find out about it. And that is what then influenced this reappraisal of Italian prog rock. And prog rock was bigger in Italy than anywhere else in the world. A lot of that was to do with the fact that all the key prog rock bands were keyboard oriented, not guitar oriented. And so Italy is kind of like the place of the keyboard as such, And so they did so, and different from Frank's, the major labels completely supported all these amazing Italian prog rock bands. And in part of that global kind of sphere of things, a lot of them were then took on the influence, the countercultural revolutionary politics of what you address with the French bands.
So in what Phillip has just been discussing, which is conscious in your minds, when you determined effectively what is written by your own discovery and sense of passion, obviously, but did you describe your approach to having written the book as about a reappraisal? Was it something that you felt needed to be written simply because you did it overlooked?
Yeah, well, definitely that was the motivation was the fact that no one that I knew this music, that there wasn't anything written in English about this music except online, and even then, when I started, it was virtually none. There's a really good blog called Psychedelic Theory, who is the source of a lot of the interviews. I've done interviews myself, and I've used a lot of his interviews. That's really grown. I don't know where's he from. He's
Sure. Yeah, it feels like that.
Yeah. So he gets a thank you in the book because he's done a lot of the original work. So it's just a case of finding out what music, thinking this needs to be heard elsewhere. There was a book that Julian Cope wrote called Kraut Rock Sampler, without an accent. I wanted this to be as close as possible to that, like something that actually steers people towards a style of music. He presents it in his own breathless way. I can't do that. Thankfully, Phillip, thanks very much for picking up the oral history. If I could, this would be full oral history. But I didn't get interviews that could do that. So as much as possible, the band members are speaking for themselves. As much as possible, the appraisal of the music is done by the music papers of the time. So I'll step in every now and again when I couldn't find someone to do the interview. Red Noise, they were very, very hard to. One did die, unfortunately, he was too sick to respond. One did respond, and I was running around for a year trying to get an interview with this guy who was really interested, but then wasn't interested. So it's been this long process. Sorry, I'm digressing a lot.
No.
Basically, it's about. I got passionate about it. I think it's very, like you said, it's not the best music in the world. Okay, it's not the best music in the world. It's not the worst music in the world. It's incredibly interesting. If you like rock music mixed with certain things, with free jazz, with old, like Pink Floyd before Dark Side of the Moon, and a band called Soft Machine, and Frank Zappa, you'll like this music, some of this music. I hated Frank Zappa until I started writing this book, and I had to listen to Frank Zappa. And I realised, because I grew up with Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, and Frank Zappa, as far as I was concerned, was a wanker. But I've discovered that up until 1970, up until Flo and Eddie joined, he wasn't a wanker. He was really clever, and he was he was interestingly political. Not like these guys. These guys are leftist. He was different. So it's about getting other people interested in that music.
So let's see if we can sort of trace some lines between, again, going back to May 68, which you said a number of the musicians were there at the barricades protesting, battling the paramilitary police. In terms of posters, these posters from L'Atelier Populaire, were there any kinds of relationships that were formed then that persevered? Were there any members of the band, and I guess in a very obvious sense, that were directly involved in this, with that collective of militants?
Right. There were four people that I know of who were in the Atelier Populaire.
Beaux-Arts,
Yeah,
because...
okay. Well, Beaux-Arts, which is where the Atelier Populaire... I mean, basically, if you look at some of these posters, they say ex-Beaux-Arts. They don't say Atelier Populaire.
Beaux-Arts is the principal art school.
So it's fine arts.
Yes.
The School of Fine Arts. And the art decorative is applied arts. So it's metalwork, presumably printmaking. So basically, the Atelier Populaire was when the students at the Fine Arts School decided they were going to produce posters for the Revolution. First one that I've got that was produced is that blue one from Ensemble d'étudiants travailleurs. That's, I think, about the second that was produced. The first one they produced was lithographed, so they could only do 50 a day. Once they realised they needed a different technique, they went to screen printing, and they started producing 2,000 a day. So it's interesting. I don't know if too many bonds were created during 1968. There was certainly, everyone had, a lot of these musicians had the same background. I think after they met, they had May 68 as the basis, even though they hadn't met then. But one band actually, one of these bands existed in May 68, it's a band called Red Noise. In fact, the cover, here we go. The cover, that's actually the singer of Red, well not the singer, the guitar player of Red Noise. It's Patrick Guillon, and if anyone knows Boris Guillon, it's his son. Right, yeah, who couldn't play an instrument. He's actually one of the original punks. His idea was, you go on stage, you can't play, no one cares. So they started, I mean, this is where I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. So I'm propagating it, I'm not 100% sure. They supposedly started playing in the Sorbonne during May 68 and continued, but most of the other bands started after that. So they had shared, I mean, with 68 it's the shared experience, the shared liberation, the feeling of liberation, and expressing that in music. Like a lot of these guys, there's a guy called Alain Roux, who's in Majon, who was on the barricades, who actually went to Palestine and met one of the Situationists there, and was Qatari, I forget his name. The guy, he's a famous, one of the famous Situationists who's really bored. So there was a lot of connection. I mean, it's, I suppose it was a small group of musicians, a small group of intellectuals that all got together in the lettrists, who are an artistic group. They were very connected with these musicians. Not so much the Situationists, they had their own part, but there was a lot of crossover between the art scene, political scene, and the music scene.
I should have said at the beginning, if at any moment when we're talking, if you've got a question or you'd like to make a comment, please don't hesitate. Does anybody have a question for either? Yes?
What does liberation sound like? How do you find that sound?
Well, okay. What the people who are in these bands would say is that black musicians who play free jazz, that's liberation music. So free jazz, that's why there's so much saxophone, that's why there's so much improvisation in the music. Improvisation is key to a lot of these bands, except Magna. And that's why they had amazing jazz players who kept leaving because they couldn't improvise. So they would say not is not liberation music, chanson is not liberation music, and Anglo-American rock is not liberation music. We need something else. And that's the same motivation as the Germans had with prog rock, Can, Faust, and Neu. It was to find another sort of music that wasn't American. One of the quotes in that is, we don't need the Marshall Plan, we don't need your overseas wars, we want our own thing. We want what's in our heads. So I actually got to interview Jean-Yves Perron from Faust, who's one of the few people whose French was who was in a prog rock band. And there's a quote from him that I was able to get where he says, basically, France and Germany were the same. I don't know if that's your question.
No, that's really insightful.
I think that it's a good question, like, what is the sound of liberation? And just even as you're talking about that, Ian, like, even though Ferry said, maybe similarities between French music, prog music, whatever it was, and krautrock, of course, remember being a British term. The British also come up with the term spaghetti western, so they're just this like dumb colonial fucking machine, like they can't, and so krautrock.
Kosmische music.
Sorry, krautrock.
If you want to be German about it, it's all. I mean, that's only the floating stuff.
So German, kraut. Right? And of course, there's meant to be some ironic, kind of cynical thing about that because of Germany in the war. But krautrock is very kind of complicated because it is a kind of like a countercultural movement from kind of like even from the mid-60s. Like bands like Tangerine Dream were originally beat bands, like big beat bands kind of thing, like 60s nightclub, like kind of the Beatles even almost in that sense, right? And the German youth from the 60s, but then definitely into the 70s, were their main, they're trying to say, I'm not a Nazi like my parents and my grandparents, so who am I? And so part of their way of opposing the German heritage, and particularly the nationalistic kind of heritage, they actually align themselves with the American occupiers, and particularly through the radio stations, where all those German youth had access to an incredible array of broadcast American music, African American and white, which even in America, those white youth didn't have access to that because it was much more regional. Like what was played in Texas was not what was played in Northern California. They were completely different. It's before FM and everything. So in Germany, it was all concentrated. They had this incredible access to all these kind of American style music. And so it was split along racial lines, and the race lines, never really get kind of fully kind of discussed about this. But in terms of krautrock, it was to do with like white anarchistic hedonism and so-called sexual liberation, which is like us Charlie Manson about that. And then, but the other is this kind of like quasi proto-political support for the enslaved like consciousness, right? So you love the blues, right? And part of that also then leads to jazz, and jazz was all about liberation and freedom of expression, and so-called free music, or instant is also the term they're using in France. But that's Germany. In France, though, since the post-war period, France welcomed black jazz more than any other culture in the world. Right? So, to the extent that by the early 70s, and the Panthers and people like this back in the States, right, it wasn't a Jim Crow kind of thing, but like, the blacks who went to France started to then politically be viewed as people who were escaping the real world oppressions that were left. Absolutely, Baldwin's like a really problematic kind of figure about that, and he knows he's problematic about it. All his talks are about, I'm treated like a prophet in Paris, and then I come back and I've got to deal with you fuckers kind of thing, And so, that's a really strong tension, and that then feeds into, I think, a lot of this alternative rock kind of prog kind of stuff, right? Where they're talking about freedom, liberation in the political sense, because that aligns with exactly what they're fighting against, the paramilitary and things like that, right? But they're also kind of cosplaying black jazz, freedom, independence kind of thing. And the only thing I'll wrap up on this, right, is still to this day, Wire magazine and all those kind of radicals and whatnot that define what's the coolest music, what's the most extreme music, what's radicalism music, right? Jazz that's completely free and improvisatory and, collective oriented and all things like that. The Charlie Hayden Liberation Orchestra that's played Australia a few times. Sun Ra kind of saying, I do not connect to planet Earth. I don't know what you're talking about. All these ways of escaping this sort of sense of, a social reality and using music to be this liberation beyond it, right? The idea of freedom, particularly for white noise artists, they always fucking crack on about, hey man, I just got to be free, I just come up with stuff, da da da. So it's like kind of cosplaying, wouldn't it be really bad if I was a slave? Kind of thing. When you scratch it, right? And then you have someone like, Winston Marsalis, right? And he says, I don't want to play freedom music. Freedom, what's freedom? It's like, what do I want to do that for? I want to concentrate on what I'm doing. I don't want to be free to do something. If I'm respectful of the music, I'm not free. I'm actually embedded in the music, But that's not a popular political, agitational kind of, in the barricades kind of view.
No, I've got an apology to make to an audience member. I cut you off about cosmic music. I'm sorry.
No, you're quite right, Ian. But you're right. I'm using it in a broader sort of recuperative sense to just recuperate a racist term of krautrock. But krautrock, cosmic music, is actually space rock so it is a little limited term. But I'm trying to revise it and use it in a new sense in that context. So mea culpa.
About cosmic music is that the synthesized music that came out of France specifically, interestingly, didn't want to be cosmic music. There was a band called Camisole who started as a free improvisational band, became a duo that was doing electronic music. Klaus Schutz wanted to sign them to his label, but Dominic Remo was one of the members. He pulled the plug on it because it was sounding too much like German music. Whereas Heldon, Richard Pinas, specifically said, I want violent music. This isn't floating music. This has to hurt. I suppose that he would say liberation, meaning he's a philosopher, he would say liberation has to be painful. And believe me, there's one album in particular, the fifth album, Rev Song Consequence, which is painful. It's the most violent electronic music guitar music you ever hear, because it's just unrelenting. There was a search for something that was different from English, different from American, different from French past, and also different from what was going on.
Excuse me, I'm just curious if the German musicians embraced the krautrock label.
Well, yeah, they did. There's a bit of there's an online debate about this. I forget, was it Orr or was it Brand? Which actually used the krautrock term, and there's some debate about whether they were the first to use it. So, yeah, it's not 100% sure that the English came up with it.
I always thought it was from the journalists.
I think what happened was the Germans came up with it, and was ran with it. Thought, okay, the English get that. And, one thing is this frog rock? Not frog rock.
You could argue it's similar to what a Baader-Meinhof gang with using the RAF initials as well, with a recuperative, or indeed what queers have done to reclaim the term queer, and all that.
I think, Virgin, of course, was big in globalising so-called krautrock and things like that through Mike Oldfield.
Can I just say one other thing? Krautrock started getting expanded in France. French would put on Tangerine Dream in Ramp. It's a famous performance. The Faust's first performance outside of Germany was in France. They just won on the way to England, so it doesn't really count. But all those bands actually used the touring circuit that was set up for these French bands. And Actuel, the magazine, was the first to write a long article about the German bands. They didn't call it krautrock. I don't know what they called it actually. I think it was just German music. So there is a relationship there, but the French didn't want to sound like that. And they didn't end up sounding like that.
Was there a sense that there was in fact a movement, which at the time between the bands, and I guess also corollary to that, was there a sense of a kind of repudiation of previous forms of French music, such as yé and chanson? Yé is it's yeah. So which is essentially sort of aping American and
She loves you, yeah.
and chanson is the sort of traditional chantonné style of a certain kind of melancholy, I'd say. So were they publicly saying we are rebelling against the orthodoxies of, because of course French, with Eddie Barclay and his label were the dominant force in France for decades. One man, his label, and he was the one promoting Johnny Halliday's. So these bands, again, there was a sense that they were part of a movement and they proclaimed as such. And equally to tell us a little bit about that reaction against the past.
Well, the simple answer is yes and yes.
Right.
So I guess yeah. The bands did feel like they're part of the movement. And the interesting thing is, again, the Brisbane thing. Brisbane, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I was able to get into gigs when I was 69, I was 14 in 1980. No, I was 14 in 78. I was able to get into gigs around by that time. And you would see the same people at every gig. There was probably 500 people in the Brisbane punk scene at most. These guys said, when I was interviewing them, there was 1,000. You would see the same people at every gig. And it was a tiny, like the counterculture music scene was tiny. Brisbane size plus, times 2 in the capital city of France. Everyone else was listening to chanson, was listening to English music. And the thing is, if you wanted rock, it was there. And all the big companies like Pathé Marconi, was EMI, they were releasing everything. I mean, their only interest was to make money out of English and American music. And or not even then, that was dying by then. So they recognized they were a scene, they were tiny. There was a few record labels, there was Futura, there was Big, which blows everyone's minds when they realise the BYG is a pun. And there you go, that's blow your minds. So BYG was one of the major independent labels. And then had some of the more chanson. Because there was Brigitte Fontaine, who isn't in the book, and I apologise all the time. Incredibly important musician to the underground. She was doing nouveau chanson, which means new chanson, and she is spectacular. But because it's so lyric driven, and I'm not that good at French, certainly can't manage poetry, but her lyrics are amazing. So for me to write about her is like me writing about Bob Dylan without mentioning his lyrics. So I just didn't. I hope that answered.
I think the easiest way to describe her music would be, I love you so much, I want to kill myself.
Or everyone else is trying to kill everyone else, but isn't it okay?
Mindful that we've got about 10 or so minutes left. Would anybody like to ask some questions or make some observations about the discussion? Yes?
I'm curious about the role of technology in all this, because just have the Vietnam War televised, the riots are televised. That's new technology. Where that nexus point between de Gaulle's France and these young people's idea of trying to create a new France, that repudiation dimension. So they've jumped on the synthesizer, they've jumped on amplified music. These are things that hadn't existed a generation before. Were they deliberately recognising that? Were they just lucky that that was there? Were they saying this is the only way we can create something that doesn't sound like what came before? And did that allow them to avoid musical structures that maybe previously would be?
Thanks, Chris. Chris is a friend of mine, and I asked him to throw me a curly question. The first half of that, I thought it was with Mark. Thankfully, he moved that into a nice direction. So, it's funny, I'd say, the title of the book is Synths, Sax Situationists. Synths, yes, modern technology, saxophone, it's modern in the orchestra. So, but yeah, they were using it's jazz. It's been around since the 20s. I mean, it was weaponized because it was following a different type of ethos. It was free jazz, squawky, noisy, liberation music. So there's a combination of new technology and old technology, but it's about it being used in a way that they thought was different from what was around. And whether you judge it to be sufficiently different from this distance is interesting. Synthesizer-wise, being a synth player, what really impresses me is they used the synthesizer as a noise machine. Prog rock used synthesizer as a keyboard. Right? People like Helen, Richard Pinas, can't play synthesizer. He's a guitarist. He had a friend, Patrick Gauthier, who could. So if there's any solos on the track, it's played well by Patrick Gauthier. But to me, when I listen to the synthesizer tracks, it's techno. It's raw machine music. And I could be wrong, and actually, I'm going to throw it over to you. Do you know anyone else around in the sort of the early 70s who was using synthesizers just so unadorned?
Well, yeah, there's all different like obscure examples of that. A couple of those famous is Silver Apples. But Silver Apples, similar, I think, Ian, to quite a few of these kind of bands, right? There's kind of like an assertion that we're doing these things, we're breaking conventions, we're kind of critiquing the industrial complex, we're kind of, and in the case of these guys, they're completely anti-Gaullist in the complete full sense of Gaullism. But then a lot, if I was to be completely honest, like a lot of the music kind of like just kind of goes down to a kind of a vaguely ongoing boogie-ish kind of groove that's got a bit of like kind of drug-induced.
Just Silver Apples.
No, just generally, I'm thinking of the whole 60s, 70s kind of like crossover. And it's very, very rare for someone in the midst of that thing of kind of just celebrating this kind of like carpeted kind of sense around of like just being in a communal household where everyone's smoking dope and somehow the sound of that energy typifies that kind of ongoing thing. And like for someone to come into that environment and context and say, oh, we'll use a synthesizer, drawing on its radical avant-garde kind of experimental status because of the nature of synthesis, the nature of electronics. Remember, it's also France that invented musique concrète and all the processes that they developed at Radio France after, from 1947. Same with the krautrock people, all the krautrock dudes, they all listened to Stockhausen, right? And so they were kind of making very high concept connections to these kind of people. But it's still quite rare for the music to evidence that. The intention's there, they're grappling with it, but it has more of that just kind of like social energy of everyone being in the scene and, yeah, we're doing this kind of thing. It's like, dude, you're just playing 2 notes there and you haven't changed the oscillate much. You know what I mean? So, but that's also kind of part of its charm in some sense, because like, this isn't Jean-Michel Jarre, or Jean-Michel Jarre kind of thing, right? who in his own way now is really kind of quite an amazing figure, and even like his really awful 80s stuff, that's hugely influential on like lots of people now. So I'm just saying all these things kind of change and whatnot, and yeah, that's why the book's important and the discussion's important, because it's all about kind of seeing that there's this like really complicated, threaded, messy tapestry of how all these things influence them. And you know, frankly, for me, coming from a kind of punk kind of background, like anything that sort of tears down the original 60s, 70s counterculture, you know, mythology and like, oh no, you had to be there. So no, I didn't fucking have to be there. Right? You know, like so, you know, there's always that other way of just assessing it, not from like the grand claims, but it's like, well, I just want to hear the music. I want to hear, you know, I want to see the posters. I want to see the movies, you know, which, you know, I would argue that the movies, as you would know, James, you know, like, you know, some amazing things came from the filmmakers that were then influenced by this scene in different ways.
Actually, you just spoke of one thing I'd like to comment on, is the music concrete, because there's another book being written at the moment about the scene. Made by an England. He's calling it Concrete Science Fiction Riot. And his thesis is that this music can, well, basically, I'm giving a history of the bands, an oral history. He's giving a conceptual overview. And his idea is that music concrete, science fiction, and these riots. And so, as soon as I heard that, I thought, no, you're wrong. With the music concrete.
Yes.
So I specifically asked everyone who used a synthesizer how important music concrete was to them. And Richard Pino said, none of my friends listen to that stuff. We listened to Terry Riley, we listened to Steve Wright. It was all minimals.
Because the GRM, like,
because it was academic.
Completely academic, and was seen as very elitist, you know, extremely elitist.
So apparently everyone had, you know, what are those records that have the reflective silver sleeves? I think it was Phillip's. It was a GRM.
Oh, and printed on top of the sleeve. Yeah.
Apparently everyone had one of those
Okay.
in their collection. But the musicians really discounted and no one uses those techniques. But the interesting thing is, Zappa used those techniques, and they did end up appropriating some of Zappa's cut-ups, which I suppose is, you know, Burroughs as well. Yeah, but the music concrete thing is a real
Dividing lines.
yeah, it's really funny. So I'm really interested to see what this guy Warren Hatter is writing. It's going to be on. I'm self-publishing. He's being published through a publisher, so he'll win. I mean, he's a nice bloke, but I just think he's a little bit off on that one.
Probably saying the same thing.
I reckon he is.
Look, we are running out of time. Well, actually, we're not running out of time insofar as that we're screening at 6:30. So what I'd like to suggest is we've got some cheese, we've got some wine, we've got some duck liver parfait. So why don't we just let's turn the mics off and please stay with us, have a drink ahead of 6:30 start, and stay for the film, please.
What film?
It's a Deux Fois by Jamie Lennon. So yes, well, most particularly thank you to Ian. Ian, as you obviously are aware, has come down from Brisbane, brought the posters with him, brought the books with him. So it's a really, really extraordinary opportunity to be with you in this place, bringing together all of these elements. So thank you for that. And Mr. Brophy, is that it? Thank you so much.
Ian, are you selling the books now?
Oh yes, sorry. Yes, I'm obviously not the head of marketing.
No, I'm not. You cannot buy this book.
So obviously Ian will be selling the book. It's $45.
It's $45. I'm sorry.
No,
It has to be $45 because
it's not a small book.
it's not a small book. But,
Are you signing them?
Yeah.
they're pre-signed and numbered. I've got a basic. I'll be
You've got
honest.
one of those pens that Donald Trump uses.
Well, I wish I had a signature. Basically, this is an edition of 68, so the first official edition. What that means is this isn't properly proofread. So you will find the next edition, which will come out in August, will be less exciting than this because there'll be less typos. No, there shouldn't be too many typos, thank goodness, but yeah, let me know.
Thanks again, and please, as I said, stay around, have a drink, and a little snack with us.